All right. Good noon, everybody, and welcome back to God Was Here, our study of the life of Christ, described in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We, in the last session, talked more about the actions of Christ. And really, I suppose the last section was not so much about Jesus himself, but rather his relative, John the Baptist. It tells us that John had died in the last part, and we saw the events leading up to that and John's personal courage at that time. And now we have a few more things to wrap up within this section of the Acts of Christ before we go into more of his teachings. So let's go ahead and jump right into that. Today we are going to be studying mainly out of Matthew chapter 14 and Mark chapter 6. Luke chapter 9 also has some of the things we're going to be dealing with, but it's mostly going to be Mark and Matthew. We'll go ahead and start in Mark chapter 6, and then after that, we'll probably jump over to Matthew's account and stay there. So, Mark chapter 6, beginning in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him that they had done and taught, all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest for a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When they went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. And when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "There is a desolate place, and the hour is now late. Send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." And they said to him, "Shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to him to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves do you have? Go and see." And when they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and by fifties. And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of fish. And those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. All right. We start this one off with Jesus seeking isolation from the crowds that are following him. Jesus' popularity certainly seems to have surged at this point. We saw a couple of sessions before that people are starting to recognize just how strong his miraculous power is, so much so that the woman with blood just touched the hem of his garment. And that was all that she thought she needed, and of course she was correct. So, they're following Jesus, and he desires isolation. There are two things we might want to point out on this. There is a certain point where you do need a little bit of time for yourself. I don't care who you are. But beyond that, if the timing here is to be understood as pretty close together with previous events, we can certainly understand why Jesus might want to break. His relative and close friend John the Baptist has died. You need some time to think about it. And so what he tells his disciples is let's grab a boat and get someplace away from people. I just need a time alone. And so he does. When we look into Matthew's account, we find out that he also manages to find a mountain that's sort of away from people. But Mark's account tells us a little more closely that the people find him anyway. The way Mark's account makes it sound is they are able to recognize the boat. They are so desperate for healing that they recognize the boat, they figure out where he is going, and they are essentially waiting for him there. Now, again, when you look at Matthew's account, they might have had a little bit of time. He's able to get up on some mountain. But they come, and they're still looking for healing. The reason I chose to read from Mark's account, though, is it has that wonderful little phrase that Jesus had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. That's really the defining characteristic, I think, of Jesus during his ministry. One of the goals of this class is to show how Jesus is not like how people portray him at all. But when we think of Jesus, we often think of his compassion, and this is why. Even at the times in which we can most easily understand Jesus wanting to be away from people, he still looks at them with compassion, and so he goes back to the work which he was doing. And he does it for quite some time. Apparently, he's doing it into the evening. And eventually, his disciples come to him and they say, it's time to send this crowd back to the villages. If they wait too long, this is ancient Israel. You don't have any 24/7 gas stations that you can go and you can get a quick bite before going home. If you wait too long, you're just not going to have anything to eat. So you got to go over there, tell them to go get something to eat. Come back tomorrow. But Jesus is still working on his compassionate work, and he doesn't want them to go. So he says, no, let's go ahead and feed them. The disciples start talking about the money. This is going to cost a lot of money to feed all of these people. I don't think they're being greedy, by the way. I doubt that they had the amount of money it would cost to do that. But Jesus asks, well, what do we have? Matthew's account tells us that this meal came from a little boy who had come. And famously, it's 2 fishes and 5 loaves of bread. Now, when you think loaf of bread, don't think, a big bag of white Wonder Bread that we might think of when we think a loaf of bread. Usually when I describe this, think more like an Olive Garden bread stick, right? A tiny little thing, something that would be reasonable for a boy to eat as his lunch. It's still a pretty big lunch, so maybe it's supposed to last until dinner time. I'm not sure. Here's the point. You're obviously not going to be able to feed a crowd of 5,000 with that kind of meal. We notice a couple of things. First of all, when Jesus takes it, he immediately prays over it. The Bible tells us that he blesses it. That's something very common we see with Jesus in regards to meals. The Bible at no point commands us that we have to always pray before every meal. But I'm telling you, it's a good practice, and it's something we see Jesus doing as well. It is reflective of an attitude that says, whatever blessing God has given to me, I'm going to make sure to thank him for it. In fact, it would be wise for us to thank God with all of the blessings. Some of us are in the habit of praying before every meal. That is good. I encourage you, though, push yourself. Look at Christianity as a discipline for yourself. Push yourself so that you may go even further and recognize that even those blessings which we do not receive regularly, such as food, those blessings that come to us, we remember to thank God for them. Jesus certainly did. He prays over it and he begins to divide it. The nature of this miracle is unclear. I don't know if it would have been visible to the people, but he manages to divide it in such a way that 5,000 people are fed and that you end up with more leftovers than you had beginning with meal to begin. Obviously, this is miraculous in its nature, and it would have been a great proof to the people. I also would point out, this is one of my favorite miracles to talk about when people want to speak about the unlikeliness, in their view, of certain events that we see elsewhere in the Bible. I'm talking about the ark, for example. Somebody might say as a criticism towards the Bible, well, the ark says that it held every single animal, or the Bible says that the ark held every single animal, terrestrial animal anyway, inside of it. And even though it was a very large boat, it still wasn't big enough to hold all the species of the earth. So what are you going to do with that? Well, there are 2 things to keep in mind with that. Number one, I do think there's a naturalistic explanation for that. I think there are 2 factors that when people make that criticism, they aren't considering. Factor number 1, the Bible never says they were full-grown animals. It's a lot easier to transport a baby elephant or 2 baby elephants than 2 adult elephants, right? Number 2, it doesn't say that every single species of Earth was on there. The concept of a species didn't even exist at that point. Ironically, evolution gives a lot of explanation to that, because there are a lot of things that we consider to be different kinds or different species, but are still able to reproduce with one another and still are the same basic type. Think of dogs, for example. I realize this is not natural selection, and so it's not the perfect example, but it helps us. I don't think that on the ark you saw two Chihuahuas and two Great Danes and two Bernese Mountain Dogs. I don't think you saw all that. I think you saw two dogs, or maybe even two wolves, and that was it. And that all the variation that we have today, ironically, comes from evolution, just not this macroevolution idea where you have one species changing to another, which, by the way, has never been observed. So I think when you consider those two things, it is totally possible for the ark to naturalistically have held every species, terrestrial species, on the planet Earth at the time. But even if it didn't, even if that's not satisfactory, it still doesn't have to be, because we are talking about God here. We don't actually have to come up with a naturalistic explanation for this working. You're telling me that the God who was able to feed 5,000 people with just 2 fishes and 5 loaves of bread, that God would also not be able to fit onto this ark more species than should be possible? So it's silly. It's completely ridiculous to not consider a supernatural explanation for this, when the whole premise of the Bible is that supernatural things do in fact happen. So I'm not particularly disturbed by that concept. All right. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Now, like I said, from here on out, we're going to go back to Matthew's account to see what happens next. This is Matthew chapter 14. After he feeds the 5,000... Oh, one more thing to mention, by the way. It wasn't actually just 5,000 people that got fed. For whatever reason, they decided to count the men only. So it was 5,000 men who were fed. We don't know how many women and children were among them. A lot of times people just multiply it by 3 and call it a day and say, well, there you go, 15,000 people were fed. I don't know if that necessarily checks out. I don't know if we have good reason to think there were exactly as many... for every one man there was one child and one woman. I think there is reason to suspect there would have been more women than men, and that there would have been less children than men, or perhaps more. So I don't know. We don't know exactly how many people is the point, but it was certainly more than 5,000. We know that. All right. Verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into a boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up on a mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was long away from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against him. And in the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea. All right. Let's pause. So after this event, he dismisses the disciples. He says, we're going to go over to the other side, to Gennesaret. And this is, by the way, the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Remember, he's up in the Galilee region at this time. But he's going to dismiss the crowds first. And also, again, Jesus needs time to be alone. So he's going to go up on a mountain and pray. But again, mirroring an incident where we already saw that Jesus calmed the Sea of Galilee while he was in the middle of a storm, the disciples seem to get hit with another storm. It tells us, this doesn't make it seem quite as bad, but it still would have been a scary situation. It says the winds were against them and they're caught up in this. Again, it says, and on the 4th watch of the night, by the way, according to my footnotes, that's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. On the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. This, again, is one of the most famous miracles of Jesus. It's not just calm water, by the way, where we see Jesus walking on the water. It's this rough tempest that is being around at this point. So he's walking towards the disciples through all of this, and their reaction is terror. Verse 26. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, it's a ghost, and they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, take heart, it is I, Do not be afraid. So here you have a miracle that is being performed only for the disciples. It gives us a little hint into the still physical way the disciples think, because when they see Jesus, despite the fact that he told them he was going to meet them, now you might understand them thinking, okay, I guess he's just going to get a boat later, or maybe he's going to walk all the way around the Sea of Galilee and meet us over there. You can understand them not thinking he was going to walk on water to meet up with them. But the sympathy for me sort of evaporates when they try to explain what they see by saying it is a ghost. Well, the idea of ghosts flies in the face of what we know about the afterlife. Famously, the Old Testament tells us significantly less about it than the New Testament does, but it still tells us enough to know there ain't no such thing as ghosts. And so for them to think so was just patently ridiculous. But Jesus, he's not going to beat them over the head with it. He just says, do not fear, it is I. And then, verse 28, and Peter answered him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, Lord, save me. Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, O you of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, Truly, you are the Son of God. All right. The disciples recognized Jesus as the Son of God over there. But as he's walking towards the water, Peter is going to show his personality. Is this the first time we really get to see the famous impulsiveness of Peter? I think it might be. I don't know if we've seen anything up until this point that shows Peter how extremely impulsive he is, except perhaps him being called to follow Jesus and how eagerly he accepts that call. But here we have it. Peter's being called, and he is going to... Actually, he's not even called at all. He just says, all right, Jesus is capable of working miracles. He must... I have faith. I must be able to do the same thing if he allows it. And so he says that to Jesus, and Jesus says to him, come. And Peter, too, begins walking on the water. But the Bible tells us that he starts looking around, and he is afraid of the waves and the winds, and he begins to sink. Famously, Jesus catches him, pulls him up, and says, why did you doubt? I think this is a commonly misunderstood section of Scripture. There's another one that we find within the book of John, which is very similar in how it's misunderstood. That is when Thomas doubts the resurrection of Christ. And poor Thomas gets although he outside of this one incident, he is always portrayed in a very positive light in the Bible. Poor Thomas gets the nickname of Doubting Thomas with us, which is very unfortunate. But he is, again, he is condemned in a very similar manner. I think this leads a lot of Christians to get a bad understanding of what faith is. A lot of people feel that they have no faith if they ever have any sort of doubt. I know we talked about this a little bit last week when it came to the death of John the Baptist. But here is a great illustration of the differences of types of doubt, because John also showed doubt. Now, how come when John shows doubt, when he says, are you really the one who is to come, or should we wait for another? Jesus doesn't say to him in the same way he says to Peter, why did you doubt? Instead, he shows him reassurance. It's because this is much more complex than we want it to be. First of all, God does not expect blind belief in him. A lot of people define faith as a blind belief or a belief despite a lack of evidence. I'm here to tell you that is completely false. That is a huge misunderstanding of what faith is. In fact, here is a great example of what faith actually is. Why is the doubt here a problem? Is it because it is doubt at all, or is it because it is doubt despite the fact that there is no longer any reason to doubt? Peter himself has been walking on the water. What on earth about the wind? If you are obeying somebody who is so powerful he can make you walk on water, why on earth would you be afraid of a little wind? It's because faith is commitment to what you already know, not what you know. It is the commitment to what you know. I like to illustrate it like this. When you were in high school physics class, did your teacher ever do this experiment where they suspended a bowling ball from the ceiling by a string or something similarly heavy and had you or another student stand on one corner of the room with the bowling ball right up to your nose and let it go so that it's going to swing in a pendulum-like fashion? Now, here's a bit of physics for you. Conservation of energy. I'm probably getting that wrong. Sorry, nerds. I didn't get that quite right. One of the a law of physics is that bowling ball, it can't come back to you and hit you, right? It cannot go beyond where it started. In fact, it cannot quite get up to where it was. But it can get extremely close. And so the reason your teacher had you do this, it was to show how much faith you have in science, right? Even though you already knew that bowling ball can't come back and hit me, so many people flinch because they have not fully committed to the knowledge. And this is what we see happening here with Peter. Peter is not fully committed to the knowledge he already has. And he looks at the danger and he flinches. That's why he begins to sink. It is not the doubting at all, but it is the doubting despite the full evidence of what is plainly in front of him. That's where Peter has the problem. I don't think Peter really deserves much condemnation from us on what we see going on here. I think he shows tons of faith, but his impulsiveness shows that he's going to make some mistakes along the way. But Peter should be admired really for his faith at the beginning here, even though he stumbles a little further down. By the way, I think this is illustrative. It illustrates something for us. It illustrates to us when we first commit ourselves to Christ in the same way, when we follow Christ, much like Jesus said, he who puts his hand to the plow and looks back is not worthy of me. Or much like Peter looking towards Christ and going towards that, but then looking towards the dangers around him. And much like when Jesus gave this warning during the limited commission, we have the same warning. We can look around the dangers of the earth and the woes and the troubles of this earth, and we can allow that to cause doubt within ourselves. And we do that, and we're going to sink. Don't doubt. Jesus is there to catch us by the hand and help us every step of the way. The Bible tells us that after this, the sea calmed and the disciples worshipped. All right, let's get to one last thing, and then we will have wrapped up this section of the actions of Jesus. Verse 34, and when they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret. And when the men of the place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment, and as many as touched it were made well. This is something easy to miss, but man, the quantity of miracles Jesus was performing. It says, I imagine people had heard rumors about how the woman was healed just by touching the fringe of Jesus' garment. So now they are in Gennesaret, a place of Gentiles. And yet, people are still clamoring for the Master. I think this really is Jesus trying to plant an idea in his disciples' heads, which is that the kingdom of God, which is to come, is not going to be for the children of Israel alone, but rather for the entirety of the world. An idea it's going to take them quite some time to really get through their heads, by the way. But they go through that. They are healed, and anyone who just touches the hem of the garment is healed. Again, I think this is illustrative of what Jesus is like for us now. Whoever comes, not with a physical sickness, but with the spiritual sickness. Physical sickness does not inflict all, but inflicts some, but spiritual sickness inflicts all. All we need to do is come to Jesus. Do what we are supposed to, and we can be healed as well. All right. that's just about going to wrap up our lesson for today. Lord willing, I'll get to speak to you again next week. Until then, I love you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.